The day my husband brought his mistress to divorce court, they laughed at me before the hearing even started. I wish I could tell you that didn't bother me. I wish I could tell you I sat there calm and confident, knowing justice was right around the corner. That would make for a better story. The truth is, I sat alone on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 3B in Knoxville, Tennessee, staring at a stain on the floor tiles and trying not to cry. I was 43 years old. I'd served my country for 15 years. I'd survived military investigations, deployment, stress surgeries, and rehabilitation. Yet somehow sitting outside a divorce hearing felt worse than all of it. Maybe because this battle was personal. Maybe because I used to love the man waiting on the other side of those courtroom doors. Brian Carter walked into the courthouse 10 minutes before the hearing. You know those people who somehow manage to enter a room like they own it? That was Brian. Dark suit, expensive watch, perfect smile, the kind he used whenever he wanted something. Beside him was Amber, 31 years old, fitness influencer, perfect blonde hair, perfect makeup, perfect white teeth. At least that's what her Instagram followers probably thought. She was wearing a bright red dress that looked more appropriate for a cocktail party than family court. The two of them walked past me without stopping, without acknowledging me. Then Amber glanced over her shoulder. I heard her whisper something. Brian chuckled. The sound hit harder than I expected. Not because they were laughing, because I knew exactly what they were laughing about. Me. The extra weight I'd gained after years of injury-related treatments. The cheaper clothes. The fact that I couldn't afford the kind of attorney Brian had hired. Amber leaned closer. I caught part of what she said. She looks older than I expected. Brian smirked. Life's been rough on her. Then they kept walking. I sat there staring straight ahead. I didn't trust myself to react. A younger version of me might have stood up, said something, started a scene. But age teaches you certain lessons. One of them is that not every insult deserves a response. Sometimes the best answer comes later. I just didn't know how much later. The courtroom filled slowly. A few attorneys, a court clerk, several families dealing with their own problems. Nobody looked particularly happy to be there. I took a seat at one table. Brian and his attorney took the other. Amber settled into the gallery behind them. The hearing started. Brian's attorney, a polished guy named David Hensley, immediately took control of the room. He spoke with the confidence of someone who expected absolutely no resistance. Because honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. At least on paper. Brian controlled most of the money. He'd frozen accounts months earlier. My savings were limited. I couldn't afford a legal team. I wasn't walking into court from a position of strength. David slid several documents toward the judge. We believe this settlement proposal is more than fair. The word fair almost made me laugh. Brian wanted the house, most of the business assets, the investment accounts, several vehicles, almost everything we'd spent 2 decades building. In return, I would receive enough money to survive for a little while. Not enough to rebuild, just enough to disappear quietly. The judge reviewed the paperwork. Judge Evelyn Parker, late 60s, sharp eyes, the type of woman who looked like she'd heard every lie imaginable. She flipped through several pages, asked a few questions. Nothing unusual. Then her attention shifted. A clerk handed her an additional file. Something submitted shortly before the hearing. The judge opened it, started reading. A minute passed, then another. The courtroom grew strangely quiet. She reached the end, returned to the beginning, and read several sections again. That got everyone's attention, including mine. Brian's attorney stopped talking. Brian shifted in his chair. Judge Parker eventually looked up. Her expression hadn't changed. But something in the room had. The air felt different. Like everyone sensed a storm coming but couldn't see the clouds yet. She turned toward Brian's side of the room. Mr. Carter. Brian straightened immediately. Yes, Your Honor. The judge folded her hands. I strongly suggest you reconsider your current settlement position. For the first time all morning, Brian looked confused. David Hensley looked concerned. Those are two very different things. Confusion asks questions. Concern already knows some of the answers. Brian cleared his throat. Your Honor. Judge Parker glanced at the file again. I'm advising you to think very carefully before proceeding under your current assumptions. No further explanation. No dramatic speech. Just a warning. The kind that sounded much more serious because she didn't raise her voice. Brian's attorney immediately requested a brief recess. The judge granted it. The second they stepped into the hallway, David pulled Brian aside. They started whispering. Fast. Urgent. Brian's face slowly lost color. Amber stood nearby trying to understand what was happening. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't smiling. I sat alone at my table, completely confused. I hadn't submitted anything new. I didn't know what file the judge had received. I didn't know why Brian's lawyer suddenly looked like he'd bitten into something rotten. But I knew one thing. Something had changed. And whatever was inside that file had frightened a man who'd spent the last hour acting invincible. I would soon learn exactly why. And when I did, my divorce stopped being the biggest problem in Brian Carter's life. People hear the word intelligence and immediately picture spies, secret missions, high-tech surveillance, maybe somebody dangling from a helicopter. Real life isn't nearly that exciting. At least mine wasn't. Most of my military career involved paperwork. Endless paperwork. I spent 15 years in Army intelligence following trails that existed mostly inside filing cabinets, databases, and spreadsheets. My job wasn't catching bad guys with a weapon. My job was catching them with records. That sounds boring until you realize paperwork has sent plenty of people to prison. The strange thing was sitting in that courtroom watching Brian's lawyer panic reminded me of a lesson I'd learned years earlier. People can fake confidence. They can fake charm. They can fake success. But paperwork usually tells the truth, eventually. As I sat waiting for the hearing to resume, I found myself thinking about a deployment from years ago. Back then, I was stationed at Fort Campbell before spending several months supporting investigations overseas. One contractor kept insisting his company had delivered equipment exactly as promised. Everything looked perfect. Every signature, every invoice, every inspection report. My supervisor at the time glanced at the file and said it was probably clean. Most people agreed. Something bothered me anyway. Not a major issue. Just a tiny inconsistency. A date that didn't quite match. A shipping record that felt off. I spent 3 weeks chasing that feeling. 3 weeks of people telling me I was wasting my time. Turns out the contractor had fabricated nearly $2 million in billing. Not because of some dramatic breakthrough. Because one date on one document didn't fit. That was usually how truth worked. It whispered. Lies were the things that shouted. Brian used to admire that about me, back when we were still partners. Back when he respected me. We met shortly before one of my deployments. A mutual friend introduced us at a barbecue outside Nashville. Brian was funny, ambitious, the kind of guy who could strike up a conversation with anybody. By the end of the evening, we'd talked for almost 3 hours. A year later, we got married. For a long time, life felt good. Not perfect, but good. When our son Jacob was born, Brian cried harder than I did. I still remember that. He stood in the hospital room holding a 6-pound baby and looking absolutely terrified. I have no idea what I'm doing. I laughed. Neither do I. Great. Great. Those were happy years. Busy, complicated, but happy. After retiring from the Army, I had options. Several, actually. One consulting firm in Virginia offered me a position that paid more money than I'd ever made before. Another opportunity would have required relocating to Huntsville. The salaries were tempting. The work would have been familiar. Instead, I stayed. Because Brian had a dream. His defense subcontracting company was still small then. A handful of employees, a rented office, a lot of optimism. He asked for help. I said yes. At the time, it felt like supporting my husband. I never imagined I'd be helping build the thing he would eventually use against me. Over the next several years, I handled compliance reports, government paperwork, contract documentation, internal controls, the boring stuff nobody wanted. Brian focused on growth, sales, relationships, expansion. Together, we built something successful. At least that's what I thought. The company grew. The money improved. The house got bigger. The cars got nicer. From the outside, everything looked impressive. Inside the marriage, things were changing. Slowly. So slowly I didn't notice at first. Brian stopped asking for my opinion. Then he stopped listening to it. Later he started correcting me in front of people. Small comments. Little jokes. Nothing dramatic. The kind of thing that sounds harmless until it happens hundreds of times. One evening at a company dinner, someone complimented a reporting system I'd designed. Brian laughed. Raven still thinks spreadsheets save the world. Everyone chuckled. I smiled. But something about it stuck with me. Because years earlier he would have said, Raven built that. Not anymore. As time passed, his criticism became more personal. Especially after my injuries worsened. The surgeries helped some things. They damaged others. Pain medication affected my metabolism. Physical limitations made exercise harder. Weight came on gradually. A few pounds one year, a few more the next. I hated it. Brian seemed to hate it even more. One night he looked at an old photograph from our 40s, then looked at me. You used to take better care of yourself. The room went silent. Even Jacob looked uncomfortable. Brian immediately claimed he was trying to help. Maybe he even believed it. But some comments reveal more about the speaker than the person being criticized. Looking back, that was probably the beginning of the end. The first signs of real trouble appeared almost 2 years before the divorce. Small things. A hotel charge in Atlanta. A weekend conference that somehow lasted 5 days. Missing funds explained with vague answers. Whenever I asked questions, Brian became irritated. "You don't trust me." That became his favorite response. Not an answer. A distraction. At the time, I wanted peace more than truth, so I let things go. Again, and again, and again. Until one afternoon my phone rang while I was cleaning out a closet. The number wasn't familiar. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead I answered, "Hello." A man's voice came through the line. Professional. Calm. "Mrs. Raven Carter." "Yes. My name is Mark Riley." A brief pause followed. Then he added 4 words that instantly got my attention. "Special Agent Mark Riley." Every instinct I developed during 15 years of investigations suddenly woke up. I sat down immediately. "What can I do for you, Agent Riley?" Another pause. Not long. Just enough to tell me he was choosing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his question was simple, but it changed everything. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "how much do you know about your husband's contracts?" The second I heard the words special agent, my stomach tightened. Not because I'd done anything wrong, because in my world, federal agents didn't make casual phone calls. They called when something serious was happening. I carried my coffee into the kitchen and sat down. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Inside, my heart suddenly felt a little louder than usual. "What exactly is this about?" I asked. Agent Riley didn't answer immediately. That told me he was being careful. "I can't discuss details of an ongoing review." There it was.
The language.
The kind government people use when they want to say something without actually saying it. "What kind of review?" "I'm sure you understand why I can't answer that." I leaned back in my chair. "I probably do." "Mrs. Carter, have you ever handled compliance records for Carter Defense Solutions?" Of course I had. For years. I knew those records better than Brian did. Maybe better than anybody. Some. I laughed. "That's a diplomatic answer." He laughed too. That surprised me. Federal agents usually weren't known for their sense of humor. "Fair enough," he said. "We may have some questions in the future." Questions about Brian. I didn't say that, which of course meant yes. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at the wall. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction either. It was exhaustion. Because deep down, I already knew what Agent Riley's call probably meant. Something wasn't right. And if something wasn't right, Brian almost certainly knew about it. The question wasn't whether there was a problem. The question was how big the problem had become. For nearly a week, I tried to ignore it. I focused on normal things. Laundry, groceries, physical therapy appointments, walking my dog Maggie, anything to avoid thinking about Brian's business. Then one evening I opened an old storage locker in the garage. The military footlocker sat exactly where I'd left it. Green paint, scratches from years of moving, army stickers faded by time. Most people would have seen a box. I saw a habit. Military people keep records, especially investigators. We learn early that memories fail. Documents don't. I opened the lid. Inside were folders I'd quietly copied over the previous year. Nothing dramatic. Nothing stolen. Just records I had legal access to while helping manage company operations. At the time, I wasn't building a case. I was protecting myself. That distinction mattered. At least it mattered to me. I spent 3 hours reviewing documents that night. The next evening I reviewed more. Then more after that. Patterns started appearing. Tiny ones at first. The same vendor showing up repeatedly. Payments that didn't make sense. Expenses assigned to projects that shouldn't have included them. Nothing obvious. Nothing Hollywood. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. The worst discoveries usually start that way. Quietly. One Saturday afternoon I found something strange involving a subcontractor. The company name sounded legitimate. Professional website. Business registration. Everything appeared normal. Until I looked closer at the address. I entered it into Google Maps. The result made me blink. Then laugh. Then stop laughing. The listed business address belonged to a closed nail salon. Not a corporate office. Not a warehouse. A nail salon. One that had shut down almost 3 years earlier. I stared at the screen. "Well, that's not great." Maggie looked up from her dog bed. I nodded toward the computer. "Apparently your mother has discovered the world's most talented defense contractor." She wagged her tail. Not particularly helpful, but supportive. I appreciated that. The funny part lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then reality settled in. If one address was fake, what else was fake? I started digging deeper. The answer turned out to be plenty. By the end of the month, I'd identified questionable invoices, suspicious transfers, accounts I didn't recognize, and several transactions that made absolutely no business sense. The more I looked, the worse I felt. Not because of Brian, because of everyone else. People always assume fraud hurts faceless organizations. That's rarely true. Real people pay the price. Carter Defense Solutions employed 27 people. I knew most of them. I'd attended weddings, retirement parties, baby showers. I knew whose daughter was applying to college, whose wife was fighting cancer, whose grandson played high school football. If the company collapsed, those people would suffer, and they hadn't done anything wrong. That thought kept me awake more than once. A few weeks later, Agent Riley called again. This time I was ready. We met at a coffee shop outside Oak Ridge. Neutral location. Public setting. Nothing dramatic. He looked exactly how you'd imagine a federal investigator. Mid-50s. Plain suit, no unnecessary movements. The kind of face people forget 5 minutes after seeing it, which was probably useful in his line of work. We talked for nearly an hour, mostly about procedures, documentation, timelines. He never pressured me, never demanded cooperation. In fact, he seemed more interested in understanding what I knew than convincing me to help. That mattered. By the end of the meeting, I agreed to provide limited records, only documents connected to my own responsibilities, nothing more, nothing less. As we stood to leave, Riley looked at me carefully. Can I give you some advice? Depends. Protect yourself. I frowned. I already am. No. His expression darkened slightly. I don't think you understand. That got my attention. What am I missing? Riley hesitated. Then he chose his words very carefully. The people we're looking at tend to look for someone else to blame. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, because suddenly several things made sense. The frozen accounts, Brian's increasing hostility, his growing desperation. I drove home thinking about that conversation. 3 days later, my fears were confirmed. A former employee called me privately, someone I'd known for years, someone I trusted. He sounded nervous. Raven, I think you should know something. What? There was a long pause. Then he said the words that changed everything. Brian's telling people you handled the financial reporting. I felt my chest tighten. So, another pause. Then came the rest. He's saying if investigators find problems, it's because of you. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid of the truth. Because I finally understood Brian's plan. The affair, the divorce, the hidden money. Those things were terrible. But this was different. Brian wasn't just trying to leave me. He was preparing to throw me under the bus to save himself. And for the first time since this nightmare began, something inside me hardened. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time it comes in layers. First you discover the lie. Then you discover how long it lasted. Then you discover how many people helped tell it. I thought finding out about Amber was the worst part. I was wrong. Finding out Brian was willing to blame me for his own decisions hurt far more than the affair ever did. Because affairs are selfish. What Brian was doing now was calculated. And that required a different kind of person. A few days after learning he was quietly shifting responsibility toward me, I received a call from a woman I'd known for almost 12 years. Karen. Her husband had worked for Brian's company since the early days. We'd spent holidays together, shared meals, attended each other's family events. When I answered, her voice sounded uncomfortable. Hey, Raven. Hey, a pause. Then another. Finally, she asked, Can I ask you something? Of course. I don't know how to say this. That told me everything I needed to know. She'd heard something. Something ugly. I waited. Eventually, she took a breath. Is it true you've been having emotional problems? I stared at the kitchen wall, not surprised, just disappointed. What kind of emotional problems? Brian said your injuries got worse. I remained silent. He said you've been struggling for a while. There it was. The beginning. The new story. The one Brian was building. The version where he wasn't a cheating husband. He was a concerned man dealing with an unstable wife. I almost admired how predictable it was. Almost. Over the following weeks, similar conversations appeared everywhere. Friends stopped calling. People who normally answered messages suddenly became busy. Church acquaintances smiled politely but avoided longer conversations. Nobody accused me directly. That would have been easier. Instead, they asked careful questions. Concerned questions. Questions designed to look compassionate while gathering information. I recognized the tactic immediately. Brian was poisoning the water. Slowly. Patiently. The way ambitious people often do. The rumors became more specific. Apparently, I had become addicted to prescription medication. Apparently, I suffered from emotional outbursts. Apparently, I couldn't be trusted with financial responsibilities. The amazing thing about lies is how creative people become when facts aren't available. The most painful part wasn't hearing strangers repeat nonsense. It was hearing it from my own son. Jacob called one Sunday afternoon. His voice sounded distant, guarded. We talked about weather, work, football. Then he finally got to the real reason for the call. Dad says things have been difficult. I closed my eyes. Difficult. He says you've been struggling. I leaned back in my chair. There are moments in life when you realize you're standing at a crossroads. One path leads to anger. The other leads somewhere harder. Patience. I chose patience. Barely. What exactly did he tell you? Jacob hesitated. Too long. Which told me everything. Mom, no, say it. Another pause. He said your injuries changed you. That one hurt. Not because it was true. Because part of it was, the injuries had changed me. They changed what my body could do. Changed how long I could stand. Changed how much pain I carried. But they hadn't changed my character. And Brian knew that. You believe him. The silence on the line answered before Jacob did. That conversation ended politely. But after hanging up, I sat alone in my apartment for nearly an hour. Just staring. Trying to understand how we'd arrived here. A year earlier, Jacob would have laughed if someone suggested I couldn't be trusted. Now he wasn't sure. That realization broke something inside me. The apartment I rented wasn't terrible. It was clean, affordable, quiet. But it felt small, especially around Thanksgiving. That year I spent the holiday alone. I bought a frozen turkey breast from Kroger, made instant mashed potatoes, watched football, pretended I was fine. People talk about loneliness like it's dramatic. Most of the time it isn't. Most of the time it's incredibly ordinary. It's eating leftovers by yourself, watching television without speaking, walking into a silent apartment after dark. The worst evening came a few weeks later. Rain tapped against the windows. Maggie slept beside the couch. I opened a storage box I'd been avoiding. Inside were photographs, old military pictures, family vacations, Jacob's Little League games, our wedding album. I flipped through page after page. There was Brian at 29, Brian at 35, Brian holding our son, Brian building our first deck, Brian helping me move into our second house. For a while I couldn't reconcile that man with the one sitting across from me in divorce court. Maybe that's why people stay in bad relationships longer than they should. Not because they're weak, because they're remembering someone who no longer exists. I eventually found myself sitting on the floor surrounded by photographs and military medals. The apartment was completely silent. I don't cry easily. Military service tends to change that. But that night I did. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly. The kind of crying that comes from exhaustion more than sadness. For the first time I seriously considered giving up. Maybe Brian could have the house. Maybe he could have most of the money. Maybe fighting wasn't worth losing what little peace I had left. The idea stayed with me for several days. Then something unexpected happened. Brian got careless. People who spend years avoiding consequences often do. Meanwhile, Jacob had started noticing things. Tiny inconsistencies, statements that didn't match, dates that changed, stories that shifted. Nothing huge, not yet. Then one evening he borrowed Brian's laptop to print a document. What he found wasn't some dramatic confession. It was worse. A collection of messages, financial discussions, conversations involving Amber, conversations that directly contradicted everything Brian had been telling him. Jacob didn't call immediately. He spent days verifying what he'd found, comparing dates, checking records, making sure he wasn't mistaken. Then on a cold January evening, someone knocked on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting visitors. When I opened it, Jacob was standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I noticed the folder in his hand. My stomach tightened, because I recognized that look. The look people get when a truth finally catches up to them. Mom, he said quietly. His voice cracked. I think Dad lied about a lot of things. And then he held up the folder. Inside was something I never expected to see. When Jacob walked into my apartment carrying that folder, I expected anger, maybe confusion. What I didn't expect was guilt. The moment he stepped inside, I could see it written all over his face. He looked like a man who just realized he'd been standing on the wrong side of a fight. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he set the folder on my kitchen table. I'm sorry. Those two words nearly broke my heart. Not because they fixed everything, because I knew how hard they were for him to say. Jacob had always been stubborn. He got that from both of us. I pulled out a chair. Sit down. He sat. I sat across from him. For a moment he stared at the folder. Then he pushed it toward me. I checked everything 3 times. What is it? Proof. I opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, financial records, internal company communications, screenshots of messages between Brian and Amber. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Brian wasn't just lying to me. He'd been lying to everyone, including his own son. Jacob rubbed his forehead. I didn't want to believe it. I know. He kept telling me you were bitter. I nodded. He said you were trying to ruin him. Another nod. Jacob laughed bitterly. The whole time it was him. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He looked exhausted, like someone who'd spent months carrying a weight he didn't understand. The next several weeks moved quickly, much faster than I expected. My attorney reviewed the new information. Agent Riley's office continued its own investigation. The divorce proceedings moved toward final hearings. And for the first time since this entire nightmare started, Brian looked nervous, not publicly. Publicly, he still acted confident. But confidence has cracks. You just have to know where to look. The final hearings began in early March. The same courthouse. The same courtroom. The same judge. Only this time the atmosphere felt different. Brian arrived alone. Amber showed up a few minutes later. They didn't walk in together. That caught my attention immediately. People who are winning usually don't create distance. People under pressure do. Jacob sat beside me. That was another change. The last time we'd been in that courtroom, he wasn't there. Now he was. And Brian noticed. The expression on his face lasted less than a second. But I saw it. A flash of concern. Then it disappeared. Judge Parker entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. At first, things unfolded normally. Financial disclosures, property discussions, asset evaluations, the usual divorce process. Then small problems started appearing. The first issue involved an investment account. One Brian had previously claimed contained very little money. New documentation suggested otherwise. Not a devastating problem, just an uncomfortable one. His attorney quickly offered explanations. The hearing moved forward. Then another issue appeared. A property transfer. Then another. An account connected to a business expense. Then another. Each problem by itself seemed manageable. Together they started forming a pattern. Judge Parker noticed. So did everyone else. Brian became increasingly defensive. His answers grew longer. People often think liars become quieter when they're nervous. Actually, many do the opposite. They talk more. Brian was talking a lot. The second phase of his collapse began shortly after lunch. That's when Jacob's documents entered the discussion. Not dramatically. Not with some movie-style surprise. Just evidence. Simple. Boring. Devastating. Email chains. Financial communications. Time-stamped records. The sort of material that doesn't care how charming someone is. Several of Brian's earlier statements suddenly looked questionable. Then one statement directly contradicted another. His attorney tried redirecting. Brian tried explaining. The explanation created two additional problems. I watched Judge Parker remove her glasses. Whenever she did that, somebody was usually having a bad day. Today it wasn't me. Brian's frustration became visible. His answers turned sharp, then defensive, then careless. At one point he denied knowledge of a transaction. Unfortunately for him, his signature appeared on the document. Not once, twice. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. Even Amber looked uncomfortable. Brian attempted another explanation, then another. Each one somehow made things worse. The judge's patience visibly evaporated. Mr. Carter. The room became very quiet. Yes, Your Honor. Please answer the question asked. His attorney closed his eyes briefly, the kind of expression lawyers make when they realize their client has become the biggest threat in the room. The third phase started late that afternoon. The phase that changed everything. Additional financial information connected to ongoing federal inquiries became relevant to the proceedings. Not criminal findings, not dramatic accusations, just enough verified information to raise serious concerns regarding disclosure accuracy. That was all it took. The issue was no longer whether Brian had been unfair. The issue became whether he'd been truthful. And courts take that very seriously. The entire direction of the hearing shifted. Suddenly, credibility mattered more than confidence. Brian had spent months building his case around the idea that I was unstable, unreliable, emotionally compromised. Now the spotlight had moved. And he couldn't escape it. At one point, Amber quietly stood up. She looked toward the exit, not running, just leaving, or at least trying to. Brian's attorney immediately leaned toward her. Sit down. She froze, then slowly sat back in her chair. That moment told me everything I needed to know. Whatever future she'd imagined with Brian was disappearing in real time. The hearing continued. Hours passed. By late afternoon, Brian looked exhausted. Older, smaller somehow. The man who'd mocked me months earlier had disappeared. In his place sat someone desperately trying to keep control of a story that was unraveling faster than he could repair it. And then something surprising happened. I didn't feel victorious. I thought I would. I thought I'd enjoy watching him squirm. I thought revenge would feel satisfying. Instead, I mostly felt tired. 19 years is a long time. Even when someone hurts you. Part of me still remembered the young man holding our newborn son. The husband who once stayed up all night assembling Jacob's first bicycle. The man I'd built a life with. Watching him collapse wasn't joyful. It was sad. Necessary, but sad. Near the end of the hearing, Judge Parker issued her ruling regarding the settlement structure. The details took time. The legal language filled several pages. But the message was simple. The court recognized assets that had not been properly represented. The financial division would be adjusted accordingly. Fairly, honestly, based on evidence. Not manipulation. For months I'd been fighting to be believed. Now I no longer had to. That was the real victory. Not the money. Not the property. The truth. When the hearing finally ended, people began filing out of the courtroom. Brian remained seated, his attorney beside him. Amber nowhere in sight. Jacob touched my shoulder. You okay? I looked around the room one last time, then nodded. For the first time in years, nobody was questioning my honesty, and somehow that felt worth more than everything else combined. 9 months later, I was standing on my back porch watching the sun come up over the Tennessee hills. The coffee in my hand was still too hot. The morning air was cool, and for the first time in a very long time, nobody was demanding anything from me. No lawyers, no court dates, no rumors, no lies to untangle. Just silence. Good silence, the kind that feels earned. A lot had changed since the divorce hearing. Some things changed quickly, others took longer. That's usually how healing works. People expect a dramatic transformation, a movie ending, a moment where everything suddenly feels perfect. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life heals in small pieces, one ordinary day at a time. The house I lived in now wasn't large. Actually, it was smaller than every home Brian and I had owned during the last 15 years of our marriage. And I loved it. 2 bedrooms, a small porch, a vegetable garden I was still learning not to kill. The mortgage was manageable. The neighborhood was quiet. Nobody cared what kind of car I drove. Nobody cared how much money I had. Nobody cared whether I looked 25 or 55. After everything that happened, that felt like luxury. Maggie certainly approved. The backyard was larger than our previous one. Every morning she ran across the grass like she'd personally purchased the property. I worked as an independent compliance consultant. Not glamorous, not exciting, but it paid well. More importantly, I enjoyed it. Small businesses hired me to help them avoid mistakes. Sometimes I reviewed reporting systems. Sometimes I trained employees. Sometimes I simply helped people organize records before problems became disasters. The funny part, for years Brian treated my skills like they were unimportant. Now those same skills paid my bills. Life has a sense of humor sometimes. My relationship with Jacob improved slowly. Neither of us tried forcing it. Trust takes time to rebuild, especially when both people carry regrets. A few weeks after the hearing, he invited me to dinner, just the 2 of us. A small barbecue place outside Knoxville. The kind with paper napkins and sweet tea served in giant plastic cups. At first, conversation felt awkward. We talked about work, sports, weather, anything except the obvious. Eventually, Jacob put down his fork. I'm sorry. There it was again. The apology. The one he'd already given before. The one he still carried. I shook my head. You don't have to keep doing that. Yeah, I do. I looked at him. He looked older than he had a year earlier. Not physically. Emotionally. Life had taught him something. Something painful. I should have trusted you. I took a sip of tea. Then I smiled. You eventually did. His shoulders relaxed. A little. That was enough. Healing doesn't require perfection, just effort. We started having dinner together every few weeks after that. Then phone calls became more frequent. Then holidays felt normal again. The relationship wasn't exactly the same, but honestly, that wasn't a bad thing. It was stronger, because now it was built on truth instead of assumptions. People occasionally ask what happened to Brian. The answer isn't very exciting. Life happened. Consequences happened. Reality happened. His company survived for a while. Then struggled. Several contracts disappeared. Financial penalties followed. Investigations continued moving through their own process, slowly, methodically, the way those things usually do. I didn't follow every detail. That surprises some people. They assume I spent months obsessing over his downfall. I didn't. At a certain point, I realized something important. The opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And eventually, I became indifferent. Brian stopped occupying space in my mind. That was far more valuable than revenge. As for Amber, she disappeared long before any of the larger consequences arrived. The last thing I heard was that she'd moved to another state. Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore. One afternoon, almost a year after the hearing, I found myself cleaning out old boxes. Inside one of them sat our wedding album. The same album I'd looked through during one of the lowest nights of my life. I flipped through it slowly. Page after page. Young faces. Big smiles. Optimism. Plans. Promises. For a moment I felt sad. Not because I wanted that marriage back. Because I realized how much time I'd spent mourning something that had already been gone. The man in those photographs wasn't the man who tried to blame me for his own actions. And the woman in those photographs wasn't me anymore either. Life changes people. Sometimes for the better. Sometimes not. I closed the album and returned it to the box. Then I carried the box into the garage. Not because I was erasing my past. Because I no longer needed to live inside it. Later that evening I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The sky turned orange over the hills. Maggie stretched out beside my chair. The world felt calm. Simple. Honest. And I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. The affair. The lies. The humiliation. The courtroom. The investigations. The long nights alone. For a long time I thought justice meant watching Brian lose. I thought winning meant seeing him suffer. But age teaches different lessons. The older I get, the more I believe real victory is quieter than that. Real victory is sleeping peacefully. Real victory is looking in the mirror without shame. Real victory is refusing to let someone else's opinion determine your value. For years I protected a man who had stopped protecting me. I made excuses, ignored warning signs, carried burdens that were never mine to carry. The day I stopped doing that was the day my life finally started moving forward again. The judge never saved me. The investigators didn't save me. The evidence didn't save me. They helped. But the real change happened when I decided I deserved better than the story Brian was trying to write for me. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Sometimes the hardest battle isn't proving someone else is wrong. It's remembering your own worth after someone spends years trying to make you forget it.